Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and today we're going to be reading for the chapter 2. Oh, this is chapter 1 and 2. Well, okay, that's why I'm reading 26 pages tonight. It is, I think I just messed something up. It is 12:48 in the morning, and I will let y'all know when I get done. Alright, so we're going to be starting off really fast with a reading. Do we need to read this? Should I read this? We're going to read it. Civilizations and cultural traditions. Civilization also differed in their cultural or religious traditions. These traditions provided a common identity for millions of individuals and for entire civilizations, even as divisions within them generated great social conflicts. Cultural traditions also made the inequalities of civilizations legitimate, providing moral support for established elites and oppressive states. But religion was a double-edged sword, for it sometimes stimulated movements that challenged those in power, and religion enabled millions of ordinary people to endure their sufferings, shape the meanings that they attached to the world and that they inhabited, and providing moral guidance and for living a good life or making a good society. By 1200, the major cultural traditions of the Afro-Eurasian world had been long established. Hinduism and Buddhism, Confucianism and Daoism, Judaism and Christianity and Islam. All of them had taken shape in the millennium between 600 BCE and 700 CE. Since they will recur often in the chapters that follow, some of their attention to their origins and development is appropriate. Alright, we're going to be starting off with South Asian cultural traditions. Hinduism. Few cultures were as fundamentally religious as that of India, where sages and philosophers embraced the divine and all things spiritual with enthusiasm and generated elaborate philosophical visions about the nature of ultimate reality. Hinduism, the oldest, largest, and most prominent religion. Oh my gosh, my pencil has low lead. Okay. Tradition in India had no historical founder, unlike Islam, Christianity, and another later Indian tradition, Buddhism. Instead, it grew up over many centuries as an integral part of Indian civilization. Although it later spread into Southeast Asia, Hinduism was not a missionary religion seeking converts, but was, like Judaism, associated with a particular people and territory. In fact, Hinduism was never a single tradition at all, and the term itself derived from outsiders, Greeks, Muslims, and later the British, who sought to reduce the infinite variety of Indian cultural patterns into a recognizable system. From the inside, however, Hinduism dissolved into a vast diversity of gods, spirits, beliefs, practices, rituals, and philosophies. This endless variegated Hinduism served to incorporate into Indian civilization the many diverse peoples who migrated into or invaded the South Asian peninsula over many centuries. One quick note, as y'all may have noticed, I have a hard time reading this, and it's because the people who wrote this really do not know how to write sentences that make sense to speak out loud. Okay? At one level, also we will be doing the AP things over here, the ones that are only pink, not the blue ones, but the pink ones. At one level, this emerging Hindu religious tradition was wildly polytheistic, which means multiple gods, embracing a vast diversity of gods and goddesses, each of whom had various consorts and appeared in a variety of forms. A priestly caste known as Brahmins presided over the sacrifices, offerings, and rituals that these deities required. But at another more philosophical level, Indian thinkers argued a more unified understanding of reality. This point of view found expression in the Upanishads, a collection of sacred texts composed by largely anonymous thinkers between 800 and 400 BCE. These texts elaborated the idea of Brahman, the world soul, and the final and ultimate reality. Beyond the multiplicity of material objects and individual persons, and beyond even the various gods themselves, lay this primal unitary energy or divine reality infusing all things. This alone was real. The immense diversity of existence that human beings perceived with their senses was all but an illusion. One contemporary Hindu monk summarized the essence of Hindu outlook by saying, "There is no multiplicity." The fundamental assertion of this philosophical Hinduism was that the individual human soul, or Atman, was in fact a part of Brahman. The chief goal of humankind then lay in the effort to achieve union with Brahman, putting an end to our illusionary perception of separate existence. This was moksha, or liberation, compared sometimes to a bubble in a glass of water, breaking through the surface tension and becoming one with the surrounding atmosphere. All right. In what ways did the religious tradition of the South Asia change over the centuries? Well, as we know, basically what happened was the Greeks, Muslims, and later the British sought to reduce the infinite variety of the Indian cultural patterns into a recognizable system. That ended up causing a massive divide it caused a divide in many of the Indian cultures. So what ended up happening is that different cultural systems formed, kind of how we saw with the, what do you call those things, the nomadic tribes and the tribes with you can look back at the video. It's the difference between the nomadic tribes and the other ones. That's kind of the same thing. That's what's happening here. Am I too close? I don't think I am. That's basically how the religion changed over centuries. I can't really go. Okay. What evidence can you find in this image to support the asceticism in Hindu religious practice? Okay. Hinduism. I don't know what asceticism is, so I'm not going to answer that question. Okay. Drink, water break. It is always important to drink water and take small, tiny breaks while reading, especially because your brain can get really messed up if you don't. Achieving this exalted state was held... Sorry, I'm breathing on the mic. Achieving this exalted state was held to involve many lifetimes, and the notion of samsara, or rebirth or reincarnation, became a central feature of Hindu thinking. Human souls, from body to body over many lifetimes, depending on the actions of the individual. This was the law of karma. Pure actions, appropriate to one's station in life, resulted in the rebirth in a higher social position or caste. Thus, the caste system of distinct and ranked groups, each with its own duties, became a register of spiritual progress. Various paths to this final release, appropriate to people of different temperaments, were spelled out in Hindu teachings. Some might achieve moksha through knowledge or study, others by doing their ordinary work without regard to consequences. Still, others through a passionate devotion to some deity or through extended meditation practice. Such ideas became widely known throughout India, carried by the Brahmin priests and wandering ascetics or holy men who had withdrawn from ordinary life to pursue their spiritual development. All right, let me see this. South Asian cultural traditions, Buddhism. Does this pencil have lead in it? Perfect. Give me one moment. Time 12. All right. South Asian cultural. We're going to take a water break. Especially because I'll be reading 26 pages tonight. And I want to go to sleep soon. We're taking another water break. South Asian cultural traditions, Buddhism. About the same time as philosophical Hinduism was emerging, another movement took shape in South Asia, that soon became a distinct and separate religious tradition, Buddhism. Unlike Hinduism, this new faith had a historical founder. Mr. Guatma. Sorry if I don't know how to pronounce that name. Right, the Guatma from that time period. A prince from a small kingdom in North India or southern Nepal. According to a Buddhist tradition, the prince had enjoyed a sheltered and delightful youth until he encountered human suffering in the form of an old man, a sick person, and a corpse. Shattered by these revelations of aging, illness, and death, Siddhartha determined to find the cause of such sufferings and a remedy for them. And so, at the age of 29, the young prince left his luxurious life, as well as his wife and child, shed his royal jewels, and cut off his hair, and set off on a quest for enlightenment that ended with an indescribable experience of spiritual realization. Now he was the Buddha, the man who had awakened. For the next 40 years, he taught what he had learned, setting in motion the cultural traditions of Buddhism. To the Buddha, suffering or sorrow, experiencing life as imperfect, impermanent, and unsatisfactory, was the central and universal feature of human life. This kind of suffering derived from desire or craving for individual fulfillment, from attachment to that of which is inevitably changes, particularly to the notion of the core self or ego, that is uniquely and solidly me. He spelled out a cure for this dis-ease in his famous Eightfold Path, which emphasized a modest and moral lifestyle, mental concentration practices, including meditation, and wisdom or understanding of reality as it is. Those who followed the Buddhist path most fully could expect to achieve enlightenment or nirvana, an almost indescribable state in which individual identity would become extinguished along with all the greed, hatred, and delusion. With the pain of unnecessary suffering finally ended, the enlightened person would experience an overwhelming serenity, even in the midst of difficulty, as well as immense loving kindness or compassion for all beings. It was a simple message, elaborated endlessly and in various forms by those who followed the Buddha. Much of the Buddha's teachings reflected on the Hindu traditions from which it sprang, that the ordinary life is an illusion, the concepts of karma and rebirth, the goal of overcoming the incessant demands of the ego, the practice of meditation, and the hope for final release from the cycle of rebirth. All of these Hindu elements found their way into Buddhist teachings. In this respect, Buddhism was a simplified and more accessible version of Hinduism. Other elements of Buddhist teaching, however, sharply challenge prevailing Hindu thinking. Rejecting the religious authority of the Brahmins, the Buddha ridiculed their rituals and sacrifices as irrelevant to the hard work of dealing with one's suffering. Nor was he much interested in the abstract speculation about the creation of the world or the existence of God. For such questions, he declared, are not useful in the quest for holiness. They do not lead to peace and to the direct knowledge of the nirvana. Individuals had to take responsibility for their own spiritual development. With no help from human authorities or supernatural beings, it was a path of intense self-effort, based on personal experiences. The Buddha also challenged the inequalities of Hindu-based caste system, arguing that neither caste nor position or gender was a barrier to enlightenment. At least in principle, the possibility of awakening was available to all. Comparison: to what extent are the Buddha teachings similar to Hindu beliefs? I'd say to the extent they're not much similar at all. Where the Hindu teachings are much more focused around a religious leader, while the Buddhist teachings are much more focused around the self. So not much at all. How does this visual representation of the Buddha differ from the description of the prince in the beginning of the section? Prince? What prince? Oh, the prince. How does it differ? Dude, what? How does it differ from the description? Well, I'd say it probably has to do something with his looks, because it's more like if he looks, if I had to say something, I'd say he looks a lot richer than he should be, but that's just me. All right, as Buddhism spread across the trade routes of Central Asia to China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, differences in understanding soon emerged. An early version of the new religion, known as Theravada Buddhism, teaching of the elders, portrayed the Buddha as an immensely wise teacher and model, but certainly not divine. The gods, though never completely denied, played little role in assisting believers in achieving enlightenment. But as the message of the Buddha gained mass following and spread across much of Asia, some of its early features, rigorous and time-consuming meditation practices, a focus on monks and nuns withdrawn from ordinary life, the absence of accessible supernatural figures to provide help and comfort, provided difficult for many converts. And so the religion adapted a new form of faith, Mahayana Buddhism, developed in the early centuries of the Common Era, and offered great accessibility, a spiritual path to much a wider range of people beyond the monks and ascetics, who were the core group in the early Buddhism. What is the difference? Theravada Buddhism was never exactly picked up on, however, Mahayana was, because it was a much more accessible version of Theravada Buddhism. In most expressions of Mahayana Buddhism, enlightenment or becoming a Buddha was available to everyone. It was possible within the context of ordinary life rather than a monastery, and it might occur within a single lifetime rather than over the course of multiple lives. While Buddhism had originally put a premium on spiritual wisdom or insight, Mahayana expressions of the faith emphasize compassion, the ability to feel the sorrows of other people as if they were one's own. This compassionate religious ideal found expression in the notion of bodhisattvas, fully enlightened beings who postpone their own final liberation in order to assist a suffering humanity. They were spiritual beings on their way to Buddhahood. Furthermore, the historical Buddha himself became something of a god, and both earlier and future Buddhas were available to offer help. Elaborate descriptions and artistic representations of these supernatural beings, together with various levels of heavens and hells, transformed Buddhism into a popular religion of salvation. Furthermore, religious merit leading to salvation might now be earned by acts of piety and devotion, such as contributing to the support of a monastery, and that merit might be transferred to others. In many forms and variations, Mayan Buddhism took root in Central Asia, China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. Buddhism thus became the first major tradition to spread widely outside its homeland. As you can see, I think spread of Buddhism. What is this trying to map? How does this map? Oh, brother. It might account for the relatively rapid spread of suggest the political, economic, and geographic factors, and it might account for the relatively. Well, firstly, it kind of spread from this region. If you remember from this region was where a lot of the early trade was happening, which is why you can see a lot of the spread of Christianity happening from here. I also believe, I might be completely and utterly wrong here, which I think I am, but I think this is where early Jerusalem was, no? And that's kind of also where it originated, but basically a lot of the early trade routes also came from here, right? In Tibet, a distinctive form of Buddhism began to take shape during the 7th century CE. This Tibetan Buddhism gave special authority to learned teachers, known as lamas, and emphasized an awareness of and preparation for death. See, this is what I'm talking about. Awareness of and, like, hello? Whatever. Its many spiritual practices included multiple prostrations, elaborate visualizations, complex meditations, ceremonies associated with numerous heavenly beings, both peaceful and violent, and the frequent use of art and music. Incorporating various elements from native Tibetan traditions and from Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism was expressed in a set of distinctive texts compiled during the 14th century. A section of these texts became famous in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which vividly described the various stages of transition from life to death to rebirth. How did the evolution of cultural traditions in India and China differ from one another? I don't think we've read about that yet. By 1200, Buddhism had largely disappeared in India, the land of its birth, even as it was expanding in other parts of Asia. Its decline in India owed something to the mounting wealth of monasteries, as the economic interest of leading Buddhist figures separated them from the ordinary people. Hostility of the Brahmin priests and competition for Islam after 1000 CE also played a role, but the most important reason for the waning of Buddhism in India was the growth during the first millennium CE of a new kind of popular Hinduism. That path took shape in what is now known as the Bhakti movement, which involved devotion to one or another of India's many gods and goddesses. Beginning in the South India and moving northward between 600 and 1300 CE, it featured the intense adoration and identification with a particular deity through songs, prayers, and rituals. By far the most popular deities were Vishnu, the protector and preserver of creation, who is associated with the mercy and goodness, and Shiva, a god representing the divine in its destructive aspect, but many also had their followers. This form of Hindu expression sometimes pushed against the rigid caste and gender hierarchies in Indian society by inviting all to an adoration of the divine. Krishna, an incarnation of Vishnu, as portrayed in the Bhagavad Gita, a famous section of the long Indian epic I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing all these, Mahabharata, had declared that those who take shelter in me, though they will be lower birth, women, Vaishyas, merchants, and Shudras, workers, can attain the supreme destination. Bhakti practice was more accessible to ordinary people than the elaborate sacrifices of the Brahmins or the philosophical speculations of intellectuals. Through good deeds and simple living and emotionally fulfilling rituals of the devotion, individuals could find salvation without a complex institutional structure, orthodox doctrine, or prescribed meditation practices. Bhakti spiritually had also a rich poetic tradition which flourished especially in the centuries after 1200. One 9th century poet illustrated the intense emotional impact of Bhakti devotion. He, God, grabbed me lest I go astray. Wax before an unspent fire. Mind melted, body trembled. I bowed, I wept, danced, and cried aloud. I sang and I praised him. I left shame behind, took as an ornament, and the mockery of local folk. This proliferation of gods and goddesses and their Bhakti cults occasionally very little friction or serious religious conflict. Hinduism, writes a leading scholar, is essentially tolerant and would rather assimilate than rigidly exclude. This capacity for assimilation extended to an already declining Buddhism, which for many people had become yet another cult worshipping yet another god. The Buddha, in fact, was incorporated into the Hindu pantheon as the 9th incarnation of Vishnu. Alright, that was 21 through 26. Now we have to read 26 through 30, which should be about another 9. This is 9 pages. Okay. 4 pages. All right. Little water break. Also, that passage, just in case you missed it, that passage mainly talked about the let's see, we'll do 12, 5, 10. That passage mainly talked about Hindu and Buddhism. Just letting y'all know, we're going to start in about 5 seconds. Got it. Okay. Chinese cultural traditions, Confucianism. At the far eastern end of Eurasian continent, Chinese civilization gave birth to two major cultural traditions that have persisted into the modern era, Confucianism and Daoism. Compared to Hindu, Christian, and Islamic traditions, these Chinese outlooks were less overtly religious, were expressed in a more philosophical, humanistic, or rational terms, and were oriented toward life in this history. They emerged in what Chinese remember sadly as the age of warring states, dreadful centuries of disorder and turmoil. At that time, some Chinese thinkers began to consider how order might be restored, how the imagined tranquility of an earlier time could be realized again. From their reflections emerged the classical cultural traditions of these Chinese civilizations. One of the traditions was derived from the thinking of Confucius, a learned and ambitious aristocrat who believed that he had uncovered a path back to social and political harmony. He attracted a group of followers who compiled his writings into a short book, the Analects, and later scholars elaborated and commented endlessly on his ideas, creating a body of thought known as Confucianism. When China was finally reunited by the Han Dynasty around 200 BCE, those ideas became the official ideology of the Chinese states and remained so into the early 20th century. The Confucian answer to the problem of China's disorder was rooted not in force, law, and punishment, but in the power of moral behavior. For Confucius, human society consisted primarily of unequal relationships: the father and son, husband and wife, the older brother and younger brother, ruler and subject. If the superior party in each of these relationships behaved with sincerity, benevolence, and genuine concern for the other, then the inferior party would be motivated to respond with deference and obedience. Harmony would then prevail. In the Confucian thinking, the family became a model for political life and a kind of miniature state. Filial piety, the honoring of one's ancestors and parents, was both valuable in itself and a training ground for reverence due to the emperor and of state officials. For Confucius, the key to nurturing these moral qualities was education, particularly an immense immersion in language, literature, history, philosophy, and ethics, all applied to the practical problems of government. Ritual and ceremonies were also important, for they conveyed the rules of appropriate behavior in the many and varying circumstances of life. For the superior person, or gentleman in Confucian terms, serious personal reflection and willingness to strive continuously to perfect his moral character were essential. Such ideas had pervasive influence in Chinese life, as Confucianism became almost synonymous with Chinese elite culture. As China's bureaucracy took shape during and after the Han Dynasty, Confucianism became the central element of the education system, which prepared students for examinations required to gain official positions. Thus, generation after generation of China's male elite was steeped into the idea and values of Confucianism. Confucianism also placed a great importance on history, for the ideal good society lay in the past. Those ideas also injected a certain democratic element into Chinese elite culture, for the great sage had emphasized that superior men and potential government officials were those outstanding moral character and intellectual achievements, not simply those of aristocratic background. Usually, only young men from wealthy families could afford the education necessary for passing examinations, but on occasions, villagers could find the resources to sponsor one of the bright sons, potentially propelling himself into the stratosphere of the Chinese elite while bringing honor and benefit to the village itself. How could this image have been used to educate students? No. Confucian ideas were clearly used to legitimate any the many inequalities of Chinese society, but they also establish certain expectations for superior parties in China's social hierarchy. Thus, emperors should keep taxes low, administer justice, and provide the materials needs for people. Quick peek. Material need for people. Those who failed to govern by these moral norms forfeited what the Chinese had called the mandate of heaven, which granted legitimacy to the ruler. Under such conditions, natural disaster, famine, or rebellion followed, leading to a political upheaval and a new dynasty. Likewise, the level of the husbands should deal kindly with their wives and children, lest they provoke conflict and disharmony. Finally, Confucianism marks Chinese elite culture by its secular and non-religious character. Confucius did not deny the reality of gods and spirits. In fact, he advised people to participate in family and state rituals, as if the spirits were present, and he believed that the universe had a moral character with which human beings should align themselves. But the thrust of Confucian teachings was distinctly this worldly and practical, concerned with human relationships, effective government, and social harmony. Members of the Chinese elite generally acknowledged that magic, the gods, and spirits were perhaps necessary for the lower orders of society, but educated people, they argued, would find them of little help in striving for moral improvement and establishing a harmonious society. In various forms, Chinese Confucianism proved attractive to elites elsewhere in East Asia, such as Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Those distinct civilizations drew heavily on the culture of their giant and highly prestigious neighbor. When an early Japanese state emerged in the 17th century, its founder, Shotoku, issued the 17-article constitution, proclaiming the Japanese ruler as a Chinese-style emperor, and encouraging both Buddhism and Confucianism. In good Confucian fashion, that document emphasized the moral quality of rulers as its foundation for social harmony. 32, I should say 3230. Makes it easier. Alright. Quick water break. Chinese cultural traditions, Daoism. As Confucian thinking became generally known in China, a quite different school of thought also took shape, known as Daoism. It was associated with the legendary figure Laozi, who, according to tradition, was a 16th century BCE archivist. He is said to have penned a short poetic volume, the Dao De Jing, The Way and Its Power, before vanishing to the wilderness to the west of China on his water buffalo. Okay. In many ways, Taoist thinking ran a counter to that of Confucius, who had emphasized the importance of education and earnest striving for moral improvement and good government. The Taoists ridiculed such efforts as artificial and useless, claiming that they generally made things worse. In the face of China's disorder and chaos, Taoists urged withdrawal into the world of nature and encouraged behavior that was spontaneous, individualistic, and natural. The central concept of Taoist thinking is Tao, an elusive notion that refers to the way of nature, the underlying and unchanging principle that governs all natural phenomena. Where Confucius focused on the world of human relationships, the Taoists turned to the spotlight of the immense realm of nature and its mysterious unfolding patterns in which the 10,000 things appeared, changed, and vanished. Confucius roam within society, the Chinese have often said. Laozi wanders beyond. Applied to human life, Taoism invited people to withdraw from the world of political and social activism, to disengage from the public life so important to Confucius, and align themselves within the way of nature. It meant simplicity in living small self-sufficient communities, limited government, and the abandonment of education and active efforts of self-improvement. Give up learning, declares the Tao Te Ching, and put an end to your troubles. Despite its various differences with the ideas of Confucianism, The Taoist perspective was widely regarded by elite Chinese as complementing rather than contradicting Confucian values. Such an outlook was facilitated by the ancient Chinese concept of yin, female, and yang, male, which expressed a belief in the unity or complementary of opposites. Thus, a scholar official might pursue the Confucian project of government by goodness during the day, but upon returning home in the evening or following his retirement, he might well behave in a more Taoist fashion, pursuing the simple life, reading Taoist philosophy, practicing meditation and breathing exercises in mountain settings, or enjoying painting, poetry, or calligraphy. Daoism also shaped the culture of ordinary people as it became part of China's popular religion. This kind of Daoism sought to tap into the power of the Tao for practical uses and came to include magic, fortune-telling, and the search for immortality. Sometimes it also provided an ideology for peasant uprising, such as the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which imagined a utopian society without the oppression of government and landlords. In its many and varied forms, Daoism, like Confucianism, became an enduring element of Chinese cultural tradition. All right, what do we got? 3617. We got a 317. Whatever he says. 3630. How about that? 36 and a 30. Wait, am I supposed to read this one? No. Ooh, I'm glad I caught that. Give me a second. This is going to be a prologue. By 2016, a number of American cities and the state of Vermont had transformed October 12th from a celebration of Columbus Day to a commemoration of Indigenous Peoples Day. Opposed in many places, such transformations of the holiday reflected a growing debate about the significance and legacy of Columbus. Was he a perpetrator of genocide, a slave trader, a thief, a pirate, and most certainly not a hero? As Winnoa LaDuke said, president of the Indigenous Women's Network, declared on the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Or should America celebrate Columbus, as the Latino novelist and publisher Jonathan McCartney recommended in 2015, remembering that his achievement of connecting the Europeans with the Americas, because without it, societies we would love not existed. Something like that. This sharp debate about Columbus reminds us that the past is as unpredictable as the future, and that it continues to resonate in the present. But it also reflects a broad agreement that the voyages of Columbus marked a decisive turning point, for better or for worse, in a world history, that they represent possibility of the most important event of the 15th century. This chapter explores the varieties of civilizations in Eurasia and the Americas in the centuries before Columbus's momentous voyages brought them together. By 1200, most humans in both hemispheres lived in a long-established civilizations, whose various customs, beliefs, and traditions shaped the political and social, economic, and cultural lives of their people. But these civilizations were far from static. Instead, they were constantly evolving, spreading, or shrinking. In East Asia, an ancient Chinese civilization continued to thrive, even as newer civilizations in Korea and Vietnam and Japan borrowed from it as they created distinctive civilizations of their own. In the heartland of a politically fragmented Islamic civilization stretched from the Atlantic Ocean across North Africa and the Middle East to India, while its frontiers extended to sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Southeast Asia. In the words of Byzantium was in a state of terminal decline, even as other Christian civilizations were emerging in Western Europe and Russia. Meanwhile, in the Western Hemisphere, civilizations were flourished in Mesoamerica and the Andes that were completely separated from those of Eurasia. In It was a world of civilizations clustered into cultural zones that, in centuries after 1492, would be tied more closely together than ever before. First by Columbus's voyages, then by the transoceanic routes pioneered by other Europeans followed him. But in 1450, these immensely transformative processes of globalization still lay in the future. All right, that was the prologue at 40 minutes. China and its neighbors. Around 1200, East Asia was among the most sophisticated and dynamic regions of the world. Am I supposed to be reading this one? No. Apologies. Well, we'll read it. It's like 2 sentences. At its core was the enormous Chinese civilization, which for centuries had experienced powerful and relatively stable states, cultural and intellectual flowering, and remarkable technological innovation and economic growth. East Asian civilizations were also expanding elsewhere. Over the previous millennium, the new states and civilizations of Korea, Vietnam, and Japan had emerged along China's borders. Proximity to their giant Chinese neighbor decisively shaped the histories of these new East Asian civilizations, and for all of them borrowed a major elements of Chinese culture and entered, at least for a time, into tributary relationships with China, but none of them were fully incorporated in Chinese states or society. Instead, they created a new distinct forms of East Asian civilization. So this should actually be changed to about 4, and I'd say 20. 4120. China before the Mongol takeover. In 1200, the Song dynasty, 960 to 1279, so we're starting to get to where we're supposed to be, ruled over large parts of ancient Chinese civilization that could trace its origin back thousands of years. Since the late 17th century, China had experienced, with a few exceptions, a period of relatively stable political rule. Successive dynasties grew on much older cultural and political traditions that in turn outlasted even the Song, enduring into the 20th century. Culturally, the Song dynasty was a golden age of arts, literature, and setting standards of excellence in poetry, landscape painting, and the ceramics, even as its scholars debated new forms of Confucian philosophy. Politically, the Song dynasty built on earlier precedents to create an elaborate bureaucratic state structure that endured into the 20th century. 6 major ministries were overseen by the Censorate, an agency that exercised surveillance over the rest of the government, checking on the character and competence of public officials. To staff this bureaucracy, an examination system was first established by the Han dynasty. An examination system first established by the Han dynasty was revived and made more elaborate, facilitated by the ability to print books for the first time in world history. Schools and colleges proliferated to prepare candidates for rigorous exams, which would become a central feature for men of the upper class. While candidates from privileged backgrounds were able to process the education needed to pass exams, village communities or local landowners sometimes sponsored the education of a bright young man from a commoner background, enabling him to enter the charmed circle of officialdom, while also bring prestige and perhaps more concrete benefits to those who sponsored him. Thus, examination systems provided a modest measure of social mobility in an otherwise quite hierarchical society. Selecting officials on the basis of merit represented a challenge to established aristocratic families hold on public office. Still, a substantial percentage of official positions went to the sons of privilege, even if they had not passed the exams. Moreover, because education and the examination system grew far more rapidly than the number of official positions, many who passed lower-level exams could not be accommodated with a bureaucratic appointment. Often, however, they were able to combine land owning and the success in the examination system to maintain an immense cultural prestige and prominence in their local areas. Underlying these cultural and political achievements was China's economic revolution, which made Song Dynasty China by far the richest, most skilled, and most populous country on earth. The most obvious sign of China's prosperity was its rapid growth in population, which jumped from around 50 million or 60 million in the 9th century to 120 million by 1200. Behind this doubling of the population were remarkable achievements in the agricultural production, particularly in the adoption from Vietnam of the fast ripening and drought-resistant strain of rice known as the Champa rice. As many people found their ways into the cities, China became the most urbanized country in the world. Dozens of Chinese cities numbered over 100,000, while the Song Dynasty capital of Hangzhou was home to more than 1 million people. For the most of the 3rd century, Italian visitor Marco Polo, Hangzhou was beyond. For the 13th century, Italian visitor Marco Polo, Hangzhou was beyond dispute of the finest and noblest city in the world. Okay. I remember whatever. Industrial production likewise soared, in both large-scale enterprises employing hundreds of workers in smaller backyard furnaces. China's metallurgy industry increased its output dramatically. By the 11th century, it was providing the government with 32,000 suites of armor and 16 million iron arrowheads annually, in addition to supplying metal for coins, tools, constructions, and bells in Buddhist monasteries. This industrial growth was fueled almost entirely by coal, which also came to provide most of the energy for heating homes and cooking, and no doubt generated considerable air pollution. Technological innovation in other fields also flourished. Inventions in printing, both woodblock and movable type, led to the world's first printed books, and by 1000, relatively cheap books had become widely available in China. Chinese navigational and shipbuilding technologies led the world, and Chinese invention of gunpowder created within a few countries a revolution in military affairs that had global dimensions. These innovations occurred within the world's most highly commercialized society, in which producing for the market rather than local consumption. Kind of sounds like... Oh, no, it doesn't. Became a widespread phenomenon. That kind of sounds like capitalism, don't you say? An immense network of internal waterways, canals, rivers, and lakes, described by one scholar as an engineering feat without parallel in the world of its time, stretched perhaps 30,000 miles, including the Grand Canal of over 1,000 miles linking the Yellow River in the north to the Yangtze River in the south. These waterways facilitated the cheap movement of goods, allowing peasants to grow specialized crops for the sale while they purchased rice and other staples on the market. In addition, the government demands for taxes paid in cash rather than in kind required peasants to sell something, their products or their labor, in order to meet their obligations. The growing use of paper money, which the Chinese pioneered, as well as financial instruments such as letters of credit and promissory notes, further contributed to the commercialization of society. Two prominent scholars have described the outcome. Output increased, population grew, skills multiplied, and the burst of inventions made Song China far wealthier than ever before, or than any of its contemporaries. However, the golden age of Song Dynasty China was perhaps less than golden for many of its women. Confucian writers emphasize the subordination of women to men, and the need to keep males and females separate in every domain of life. The Song Dynasty historian and scholar Sima Guang summed up the prevailing view. The boy leads the girl follows the boy. The duty of the husbands to be resolute and the wives to be docile begins with this. For elite men, masculinity came to be defined less in terms of horseback riding, athleticism, and warrior values, and more in terms of refined pursuits of calligraphy, scholarship, painting, and poetry. Corresponding views of feminine qualities emphasized women's weakness, reticence, and delicacy. Furthermore, a rapidly commercializing economy undermined the position of women in the textile industry. Urban workshops and the state factories run by men increasingly took over the skilled tasks of weaving textiles, especially silk, which had previously been the work of rural women in their homes. Although these women continued to tend silkworms and spin silk threads, they had lost a more lucrative income generating work of weaving silk fabrics. Oh brother. Okay, guys. Graphic warning, I'm probably, most likely, I'm just going to skip over it in the video. The most compelling expression of a tightening patriarchy among elite women lay in foot binding, apparently beginning among dancers and the courtesans in the 10th or 11th century CE. This practice involved the tight wrapping of young girls' feet, usually breaking the bones of the foot and causing intense pain. During and after the Song dynasty, foot binding found general acceptance among elite families and later became even more widespread in Chinese society. It was associated with new images of female beauty and eroticism that emphasized small size, frailty, and deference, and served to keep women restricted to the inner quarters, where Confucian tradition asserted that they belonged. For many women, it became a rite of passage, and their tiny feet in beautiful slippers that encased them became a source of some pride and even a topic of poetry for some. So we're not going to be looking at foot binding. In other ways, though, there were more positive trends in the lives of women during the Song dynasty. Their property rights expanded, allowing women to control their own dowries and inherit property from their families. Neither in earlier nor in later periods, writes one scholar, did as much property pass through women's hands as during the Song dynasty. Furthermore, lower-ranking but ambitious officials strongly urged the education of women, so that they might more effectively raise their sons and increase the family's fortune. The Song dynasty China, in short, offered a mixture of tightening and restrictions and new opportunities for its women. Alright, let's see. Am I supposed to do this one? What am I on? 58? Yes, I am. Alright, time? 51:50. Sorry, I'm doing this for timestamps because I gotta do that. Drink. Interacting with China, Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. I have to read 10 pages. Oh my gosh. No, I don't. 5. 4 or 5. On the northern and southern borders of Song China, two new kingdoms, Korea and Vietnam, were taking shape under the influence of China. But unlike the native peoples of southern China, who largely became Chinese, the peoples of Korea and Vietnam did not. They retained distinctive identities which have lasted into modern times. While resisting Chinese political domination, they also appreciated and adopted elements of Chinese culture and sought the source of Chinese wealth and power. Immediately adjacent to northern eastern China, the Korean peninsula and its peoples have long lived in close proximity to their much larger neighbor. Under a succession of dynasties, the unified Silla, Koryo, and Joseon, Korea generally maintained its political independence while participating in a tributary relationship with China. Regular Korean missions to the Chinese imperial court acknowledged China's preeminent position in East Asia by presenting tribute, products of value produced in Korea, and performing rituals of submission. In return, the Chinese emperors gave their Korean visitors gifts or festivals to take back to Korea, reaffirmed peace relations, and allowed both official and personal trade to take place between the two states. Chinese culture had a pervasive influence on Korean political and cultural life in many ways. For instance, efforts to plant Confucian values in Chinese culture in Korea had what one scholar had called an overwhelmingly negative impact on Korean women. Particularly after 13,000. We're not even in the year 3000. Early Chinese observers noticed and strongly disapproved of free choice marriages in Korea, as well as the practices of women singing and dancing together late at night. With the support of the Korean court, Chinese models of family life and female behavior based on the Confucian concept of filial piety gradually replaced the more flexible Korean patterns, especially among the elite. Korean customers, women giving birth and raising their young children in their parents' home, funeral rites in which a husband buried in the sacred plot of his wife's family, the remarriage of widowed or divorced women, the female inheritance of property eroded under the pressure of Confucian orthodoxy. Korean restrictions on elite women, especially widows, came to exceed even those of China itself. Still, in Korea remained Korean. After 688, the country's political independence, though periodically threatened, was largely intact. The Chinese cultural influence, except for Buddhism, had little impact beyond the aristocracy and certainly did not penetrate the lives of Korean serf-like peasants, nor did it register among Korea's many slaves, who amounted to about 1/3 of the country's population by 1100. A Chinese-style examination system to recruit government officials, though encouraged by some Korean rulers, never assumed the prominence that it gained in Song Dynasty China. Korea's aristocrat class was able to maintain an even stronger monopoly on bureaucratic office than its Chinese counterpart did, and in the mid-1400s, Korea moved toward a greater cultural independence by developing a phonetic alphabet known as the Hangul for writing the Korean language. Although resisted by conservative male elites who were long accustomed to using the more prestigious Chinese characters to write Korean, this form of writing gradually took hold, especially in private correspondence and popular fiction, and among women. Clearly part of Chinese world order, Korea nonetheless retained a distinctive culture as well as a separate political existence. At the southern fringe of the Chinese cultural world, the people who eventually came to be called Vietnamese had a broadly similar historical counter with China. As in Korea, the elite culture of Vietnam borrowed heavily from China, adopting Confucianism, Daoism, Buddhism, administration techniques, and the examination system, and artistic and literary styles. Even as its popular culture remained distinctive, and like Korea, Vietnam achieved political independence while participating fully in the tribute system as a vassal state. Unlike Korea, however, the cultural heartland of Vietnam in the Red River Valley was fully incorporated into the Chinese state for more than 1,000 years. Even in 1200, centuries after securing their independence, Vietnam rulers carefully maintained Vietnam's tributary role, sending repeated missions to do homage at the Chinese courts. Successive Vietnamese dynasties found the Chinese approach to the government useful, styling the rulers as emperors, claiming the mandate of heaven, and making use of Chinese court rituals. More so than in Korea, a Chinese-based examination system in Vietnam functioned to undermine an established aristocracy, to provide some measure of social mobility for commoners, and to create a merit-based scholar gentry class to staff the bureaucracy. Furthermore, members of the Vietnamese elite class remained deeply committed to Chinese culture, viewing their own country less as a separate nation than as a southern extension of universal civilization, the only they knew. Beyond the elite, however, there remained much that was uniquely Vietnamese, such as the distinctive languages and fondness for fighting, and the habit of chewing betel nuts. More importantly, Vietnam long retained a greater role for women in social and economic life. Despite heavy Chinese influence in the 3rd century CE, a woman leader of an anti-Chinese resistant movement declared, "I want to drive away the enemy to save our people. I will not resign myself to the usual lot of women who bow their heads and become concubines." Female nature deities and a female Buddha continued to be part of Vietnamese popular religion, even as Confucianism ideas took root among the elite. In centuries following the independence from China, as Vietnam expanded to the south, northern officials tried in vain to impose a more orthodox Confucian gender practices in place of local customs that allowed women to choose their own husbands and married men to live in households of their wives. So persistent were these practices that a 17th century Chinese visitor commented with disgust that Vietnamese preferred the birth of a girl to that of a boy. These features of Vietnamese life reflected larger patterns of Southeast Asian culture that distinguished it from China, and like Koreans, the Vietnamese developed a variation of Chinese writing called Chu Nam, which means Southern script, which provided the basis for an independent national literature and a vehicle for the writing of most educated women. Unlike Korea and Vietnam, the Japanese islands were physically separated from China by 100 miles or more of ocean, and were never successfully invaded or conquered by their giant mainland neighbor. Thus, Japan's very extensive borrowing from Chinese civilization was wholly voluntary, rather than occurring under conditions of direct military threat or outright occupation. The high point of borrowing took place during the 7th to 9th century, as the first more or less unified Japanese states began to emerge from dozens of small clan-based aristocratic chiefdoms. That state found much that was useful in China and set out deliberately and systematically to transform Japan into a centralized bureaucratic state on the Chinese model. Chinese culture, no less than its political practices, also found in favor in Japan. Various schools of Chinese Buddhism took root, first among the educated and literate classes, and later more broadly Japanese society. Buddhism deeply affected the Japanese art, architecture, education, medicine, views on the afterlife, and attitudes towards suffering and impermanence of life. The Chinese writing system, and with its interesting in historical writing, calligraphy, and poetry, likewise proved attractive among the elite. But the absence of compelling threat from China made it possible for the Japanese to be selective in their borrowing. By the 10th century, deliberate efforts to absorb additional elements of Chinese culture were diminished, and formal tribute missions to China had stopped, although private traders and Buddhist monks continued to make the difficult journey to the mainland. Over many centuries, the Japanese combined what they had assimilated from China with elements of their own tradition into a distinctive Japanese civilization. In the political realm, for example, the Japanese never succeeded in creating an effective centralized and bureaucratic state to match that of China. Although the court and emperor retained an important ceremonial and cultural role, their real political authority over the country gradually diminished in favor of competing aristocratic families, both at court and in the provinces. As political power became increasingly decentralized, local authorities developed their own military forces, the famous samurai warrior class of Japan. Bearing their exquisite curved swords, the samurai developed a distinctive set of values featuring bravery, loyalty, endurance, honor, great skill in martial arts, and a preference for death over surrender. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior. Japan's celebration of the samurai and the military virtues contrasted sharply with China's emphasis on intellectual achievements and political office holding, which were accorded higher prestige than bearing arms. The educated men of the land, wrote a Chinese minister in the 11th century, regarded the carrying of arms as a disgrace. The Japanese clearly did not agree. Religiously as well, Japan remained distinctive, although Buddhism in many forms took hold in the country. It never completely replaced the native beliefs and practices, while focused its attention on numerous kami, sacred spirits associated with human ancestors and various natural phenomena. Much later referred to as Shinto, this tradition provided legitimacy to the imperial family based on claims of descent from the sun goddess. Because veneration of the kami lacked an elaborate philosophy or ritual, it conflicted very little with Buddhism. In fact, numerous kami were assimilated into Japanese Buddhism as local expression of Buddhist deities of principles. Japanese literacy and artistic cultures likewise evolved in distinctive ways. Despite much borrowing from China, as in Korea and Vietnam, there emerged a unique writing system that combined Chinese characters with a series of phonetic symbols. A highly refined aesthetic culture found expression at the imperial court, even as the court's real political authority melted away. Court aristocrats and their ladies lived in splendor, composed poems, arranged flowers, and conducted their love affairs. What counted, one scholar wrote, was the proper costume, the right ceremonial act, the successful turn of a phrase in a poem, and the appropriate expression of refined taste. The Tale of Genji, a Japanese novel written by a woman author, Murasaki Shikibu, around 1000, provides an intimate picture of the intrigue and romances of court life. Oh my gosh, I said it's at this level of society, Japan's women, unlike those in Korea, largely escape the oppressive features of Chinese Confucian culture, such as the prohibition of remarriage for widows and seclusion within the home. Japanese women continued to inherit property. Japanese married couples often lived apart or with their wives' family, and marriages were made and broken easily. None of these corresponded to Confucian values. When Japanese women did begin to lose status in the 12th century, and later, it had less to do with Confucian pressures than with the rise of warrior culture. Alright, I will see you guys later. I am extremely tired. What time is it? Time reveal? Oh, it's 1:55.